Defeat near. Ukraine seems cornered. Russian advances are becoming faster and deeper into its territory. Russia's devastating airstrikes against critical infrastructure, the corruption scandal involving Zelensky uncovered last week, and now the recent peace plan proposed by the United States. All these factors create an unsustainable situation for Ukraine, even more so for its lame duck president, Volodymyr Zelensky. We appear to be getting closer and closer to a total defeat for Ukraine. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 293 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through memberships, PayPal, and any interaction on the platform. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, is our dear Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, how are things over there?
How are you? Very well. Here, I imagine it's cold, just like in Berlin.
Yes, in fact, with a terrible hoarseness from the cold and rain here. Juan Antonio, my dear, so many developments, even today's, an unsustainable situation. Where do we begin our analysis of the current geopolitical situation in relation to Ukraine?
Look, I think right now a whole series of factors are starting to converge. They were all already there, you know. What's happening is that I think we've reached the point where each actor is acting according to their own exclusive interests, and what was already a reality is becoming evident. A reality we've been talking about for 2 or 3 years. It had turned into an industrial war of attrition that Ukraine was not going to be able to win. In fact, not even NATO was going to be able to win. So what's happening? Well, there comes a moment when the situation becomes so serious that before it ends in a debacle, a main actor, the United States, has said, well, we have to force the situation. Because if this keeps going the way it is, what we're going to have is a debacle. And what does it mean to force the situation? They were clear about 2 things. First, what the situation on the ground is. Very clear. That is, the Western press can lie all it wants, but the Americans not only have observers on the ground, they also have all their satellite reconnaissance systems and know perfectly well what the reality is. And the second is that as long as Zelensky and his crew remain in power in Kyiv, obeying other actors as well, the Europeans and the British, there's no possibility of negotiating with Russia. How can those 2 factors start to be resolved? The one on the front can't be easily solved. What we have to try to do is stop it. Stop it by any means. The other factor, what is it? Start exposing Zelensky's dirt. All the corruption of the gang that governs in Kyiv, which was already known. In other words, the true nature of the Kyiv regime was already perfectly well known, even before the Russian military intervention. We simply bring it to light, undermine that regime, and then there's no choice but to go after them. Then once that has happened, we'll talk. I'll put forward a peace plan that I'm going to impose, and I'll impose it because Zelensky has no other option but to accept it or leave, if they even let him leave. That's it. So, well, that's more or less the context.
Entonces, bueno, este es un poco el contexto, y entonces, ¿qué tenemos, no?
So then what do we have? To start at the end, the presentation of a supposed 28-point plan. Apparently it wasn't negotiated, but it was shared between October 24 and 26 by Steve Witkoff with the Russian envoy Dmitriev in Miami. That's where the 28-point plan was presented. Naturally, it wasn't an official presentation because it was done by Steve Witkoff, who, after all, we must remember, is a trusted associate of Trump, but holds no political position. As the saying goes, he's a nobody. But we do know that he is indeed Donald Trump's key envoy for this matter. So the United States shows up and, well, I imagine the Russians acknowledge receipt and wait. As I said, this happened on October 24th. That is about a month ago. We can't know for sure, but it's very possible that Witkoff told Dmitriev that Zelensky's corruption scandals and those of his circle were about to start coming out. So, since the Russians no longer trust the West in anything, they've continued acting in their usual way, that is, advancing militarily and waiting for events to unfold, right? Well, now the plan has been presented. It's a 28-point plan that clearly represents a capitulation and a strategic defeat for NATO, imposed by an unsustainable reality, the battlefield situation, and the internal breakdown of the Kiev regime. That's the reality. So, well, yes, let's see, what does this peace plan propose? We have to keep in mind that we don't have the official version. What we have is basically what's been leaked to the Wall Street Journal, Axios, Politico, and I think a few other English-language outlets. In other words, we don't have the full version. But based on what's been leaked, if it's accurate, we can indeed talk about that capitulation and NATO's strategic defeat. Why? Because first, Kiev would have to give up all of Donbass, cut its army in half, that is, the so-called demilitarization. Of course, no joining NATO and no foreign troops on its territory. And no offensive weapons, for example, the so-called long-range weapons, which are just regular cruise missiles, but they call them long-range. I don't know why. Long-range, just to remind all our viewers, means anything that goes beyond 5,500 kilometers. The Tomahawks, the Decants, and the Caliber don't even reach 1,200 kilometers. 1,500 kilometers, in the best-case scenario. What else? There are other types of concessions. Recognition of Russian as an official language in Ukraine, formal status for the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and finally the lifting of all sanctions, the return of frozen funds, and a new European security architecture that includes Russia. This issue was the main one from a geostrategic point of view that led to this point. Not just 2014, but, well, the point of Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference. This is the fundamental issue. So without knowing, because no one yet knows what the actual document presented is, this is what has been leaked. Moreover, they don't present it as a negotiation, but as a done deal. In other words, it's something already discussed between the Russian side and the American side. And therefore, what's being presented to Kiev is, this is how it is. Well, this can only be interpreted one way, as a total defeat. Someone might say, well, but there would still be future Russian objectives, right? That is, the ones that were considered, for example, Kharkiv, the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. What happens here, of course, is that there begins to be a shift in the Russian strategic perspective, moving from the objectives set so far to seeking the reunification of Ukraine within the Russian Federation. Who is expressing this? Well, one of the opposition figures in exile, Viktor Medvedchuk, has stated that Ukraine will not survive as a state, and that the goal of Medvedchuk's political movement will be the reunification of Ukrainians with Russia. Perhaps this is the strategic projection the Russians might be considering for the future. That is, fostering a social movement that eventually wins elections and takes power in Kyiv to begin a process similar to the union state that Russia has with Belarus. This would make unnecessary any conquest or subversive secessionist movement in those 2 or 3 regions that would still remain under Kyiv's control. That would be the general idea.
Este sería un poco el planteamiento, ¿no? ¿Cuál es la realidad que impone el plan?
What reality does the plan impose? As I've said, the military situation is desperate. Today we've officially learned that the city of Kupiansk is in Russian hands. Why has Kupiansk fallen before Prokhorovka when the advance in Prokhorovka is much greater? It's very simple. Because with NATO's usual foolishness, they keep throwing in reserves to try to hold Prokhorovka. And of course that weakens other parts of the front. And what happens then? The Russians advance in Prokhorovka, they advance in Zaporizhia, and at an accelerated pace they've taken Kupiansk, they've already entered Lyman, they've practically entered and are also surrounding Seversk, and they control 80% of Vovchansk, which is the gateway to Kharkiv, also under Russian control.
It's the moment, just a short while ago, Juan Antonio, of Gerasimov's announcement about the capture of Kupiansk, indeed.
So of course, the Russian advance on multiple fronts. If you add to that the massive casualties, we're talking about an average of between 1,200 and 1,500 casualties per day. The desertions, as we've said before, have multiplied. That is, they're 4 times higher than last year. There's been an exchange of soldiers' bodies, again, 1,000 Ukrainians for 38 Russians. That's the ratio, 1,000 to 38. Okay? Someone might say, well, since the Russians are the ones advancing, they recover more of their own bodies. Fine, then double, triple, quadruple the Russian number. I don't care. The difference is still outrageous. Outrageous. A ratio of practically 18.5 to 1. Make it 15 to 1, 12 to 1. It doesn't matter. That doesn't change the reality of the situation.
No cambia la realidad, ¿no?, de la situación. Y a esto únase también la...
And to this we must also add the systematic destruction of critical infrastructure, industrial facilities, transportation lines, and power grids throughout Ukraine. The ports, the airports, the military bases, the air bases, the industries. And well, there's the situation on the fronts. And the other pillar that has cracked and begun to collapse is the internal situation. A major corruption scandal that has already affected several ministers and even the head of Zelensky's presidential office. It all started, as a joke almost, with $100 million in the Mindich case, related to the energy sector. Now defense contracts have surfaced and the issue of cryptocurrencies has come up as well. Anyway, we can discuss more later, but what is clear is that this directly affects Zelensky himself.
Esto afecta directamente al propio Zelensky. De hecho, vamos a ver.
In fact, let's see. All of this was brought to light by Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the NABU. It's an anti-corruption institution controlled by the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, meaning it reports directly to the White House. And this institution, whose investigations were already known and even leaked a few months ago, was one that Zelensky tried to shut down. Large protests broke out across Ukraine, including in Kyiv. And in the end, Zelensky had to resign himself to letting these people continue their work. Let's not fool ourselves. The protests were encouraged by the same people who run the anti-corruption office. In other words, it all comes from the same source, the United States, the administration. The NABU's accusation against Mindich and Zelensky's entire circle is for creating a criminal organization and illegally enriching themselves in multiple economic sectors, energy, defense, as I mentioned, and others, taking advantage of the state of war. Money laundering, mainly through cryptocurrencies, it's estimated at about $5 billion. $5 billion. And of course, all of this involves influence peddling, with high-ranking officials allowing these things to happen. The NABU document, which appears to have been leaked, I don't have it yet, but it's been leaked on some Ukrainian channel, explicitly mentions that Mindich naturally acted by taking advantage of his friendly relations with Zelensky. But it seems that out of the 1,000 hours recorded by Nabu, only about 100 hours have been made public.
Solo se han hecho públicas unas 100 horas. Y de momento, Nabu ha informado que...
And for now, Nabu has reported that it's not going to make anything public. For now, nothing more. What does this mean? Well, that someone has already said, we have all this, and you either comply or this will come out. For now, I'm not releasing it. I'm waiting for you to comply. And apparently there are already hours-long conversations, even ones involving Zelensky. So this is the beginning of the end. We don't know how long it will last, but this is the beginning of the end for the people involved in this. Well, Umerov is the Minister of Defense, the one who provided ministry funds to companies belonging to the aforementioned Mindich, and who went off to Turkey over a prisoner exchange issue that wasn't negotiated with anyone. No one, the Russians weren't there, and who later traveled to the United States. We don't know if he'll return to Ukraine, or if he's already decided to stay in the United States. German Galushchenko is the Minister of Energy. He's the one who allowed this whole clique to take control of the energy sector. He's been dismissed. There was no other choice, of course, by the Rada. Vitaly Brosko is the head of security at Naftogaz, because the gas issue is also involved in this whole network, laundering hundreds of millions through cryptocurrencies. He's under arrest. And the last one I'll mention, because there are others, high-ranking officials, the Minister of Agriculture, but I'll name one very important figure since he's number 2, Zelensky's right-hand man, is Andrei Yermak, the strongman in Kiev, identified as the Ali Baba of the widespread corruption scheme. Apparently he's been given an ultimatum to resign. They've given him until November 25th, so in the coming days we'll find out whether that's going to happen.
Saldremos de dudas en los próximos días de si esto va a ser así, ¿no? Y bueno, ¿qué nos indica todo esto?
What does all this tell us? That Kiev was a corrupt regime. We already knew that. We've said it 1,000 times, even though the whole gang of Western press slugs who go around licking the boots and asses of every European political leader called us Kremlin agents and other nonsense. We've said this 100 times, among other things because they themselves said it before the Russian military intervention. So, we didn't make anything up. Transparency International already listed Ukraine as the most corrupt country in all of Europe. No one should be surprised by any of this. What is clear, though, is that the regime is a puppet regime, completely dependent on the outside, not just in finances, weaponry, the economy, diplomacy. Not only that, but every decision depended on what its foreign masters said.
Dependía de lo que dijeran sus amos del exterior. Por eso algunos nos hemos desgañitado.
That's why some of us have been shouting ourselves hoarse for 3 years, saying that this wasn't a war between Russia and Ukraine, but a war between Russia and whoever was in charge in Ukraine, which was NATO. It couldn't be more obvious now. Anyone who doesn't see it at this point can only be either a complete fool or one of them, because they defend them, because they're part of NATO's military structure. In other words, because they're part of the conflict, because they're a belligerent. When Nabu describes all this as an international criminal organization and we know about this dependency, well, then we have to think that the headquarters of that criminal organization is not in Kiev. The headquarters of that criminal network must be in Washington, Brussels, and London, because there's no way they didn't know. Of course they knew. They've known for months, at least for months. That's why Zelensky tried to shut down the anti-corruption office, without even going back to the matter of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and all those corrupt dealings we already knew about.
No?
It also becomes evident that an official state institution, such as NABU, the Anti-Corruption Union, depends on foreign powers. It doesn't even have autonomy for that. It is a tool of U.S. control over the Ukrainian leadership, which can't do anything without consulting. Why? Because they're compromised. Because they're caught like so many corrupt figures in so many countries. Since they're compromised, they'll do whatever their master tells them, inevitably. The consequence. The time has come when faced with a collapse that could end in a spectacle like Kabul's, and with a situation that continues to carry both internal and external political costs for the Trump administration, as well as an economic cost. Let's not forget, although they've tried to start closing that gap, it's the Europeans who end up paying.
Diciendo que paguen los europeos. Para eso Pedro Sánchez va a regalar casi 1.000 millones.
For that, Pedro Sánchez is going to give almost €1 billion to Zelensky on his last visit. They've been here doing stupid things. So what does the United States say? Before that, and since it also wants to do business with Russia, because it needs to, because it needs guaranteed energy resources for its oil companies, because it needs rare earths, because it needs all that, there's no choice but to replace Zelensky's corrupt team with a direct colonial administration. For example, who? And this is just an example. The former Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Ms. Markarova.
The one crying at the moment of the fight in the White House, already in tears.
That lady, exactly. And in that way, they can already have direct control over some Ukrainian resources that the United States also needs, and for which it even signed an agreement with Zelensky himself, the famous rare earths agreement. Rare earths that, of course, as mines and Ukrainian territory keep falling, they either act soon or by the time they try to enforce the agreement, half of it will be void because those areas are already under Russian control. And well, this leads to something we've also been saying, something we've also been observing, that the United States goes one way, according to its own interests, and the European Union goes another. That the United States has a plan B, which is to dress up the defeat with something it can boast about and pin a medal on itself for, while the European Union has no plan B. There's nothing. What is the European Union limited to? Well, apart from fracturing, because logically Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and a few others have reduced their support for Kiev, the EU ambassador to Ukraine is busy criticizing NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and defending one of the ringleaders of the criminal network, Mr. Yermak. In other words, there's a clear split between the intentions Donald Trump has in the White House and those pursued by Brussels and London. The latest news I have, for example, is that Yermak tried to arrange a secret meeting in London with Sullivan, and he refused. In short, everyone is starting to reposition themselves and try to assess the damage, to see how they can get out of this. Zelensky is facing an ultimatum, if he hasn't already been given one.
Zelensky se enfrenta a un ultimátum. Si no se lo han dado ya, Si no se lo han dado. Y es que al final
in the end, they're going to make all financial and military aid conditional on the fall of a whole series of figures. But his personal authority is already completely eroded, and there will be no other choice. Once they remove, Umero and Galichenko are already gone. Once they remove Yermak, then it will be him. He'll be next, inevitably, because they also know that Russia won't negotiate with him. That is, it's not written down anywhere, but it's a Russian condition. Finally, with a desperate military situation, I won't repeat the data, where on the ground they're carrying out truly suicidal, frantic, senseless operations at high cost, trying to bomb civilian areas or industries inside Russia. In short, a whole series of actions that lead nowhere and only serve to gradually erode things even further. And winter is coming. And tomorrow, today is Thursday, we're saying this now. Tomorrow there will already be a statement from the Ukrainian Ministry of Energy about the hours when there will be no power in Kiev. For several hours there will be no electricity because they can no longer produce it at the level needed to maintain the bare minimum, which is street lighting and normal household electricity. Let's not even talk about industry. As I said, the suspension of the release of the recordings they have, I think, is part of the behind closed doors negotiations. I've already mentioned this, that I don't know whether are taking place in Turkey, in London, over the phone, or if that group of high-ranking U.S. military officers who showed up in Kiev personally brought the peace plan to Zelensky.
Many questions, Juan Antonio. But before the first one, I want to emphasize the fact that both you and Fernando, myself, and the rest of the DMP analysts have been presenting this analytical perspective for about 4 years now, right? Now it's finally confirmed for everyone, isn't it? But for 4 years we've been insisting that what we're seeing in Ukraine is not Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. Not because of Putin's imperialism, but rather, as Sanchez said, we are indeed witnessing a confrontation that resulted from NATO's imperialist expansion toward Russia until Russia drew a line. And there, consequently, Zelensky responded directly as a puppet of the United States, something now fully confirmed, right? I wanted to emphasize that as a vindication for all of us, dear Juan Antonio, not only because the truth is on our side, but also because of all the consequences we've endured up to this point. Not just insults and so on.
I'll tell you more, and what's going to come out. That is, as this keeps rotting and fading away, everything inside that box of filth will start to appear. For example, there are already mentions of a massive energy fraud orchestrated by the European Union itself. Because, as I said, the center of the criminal organization isn't in Kiev, since Kiev couldn't have done anything if it weren't part of a larger structure. So, there would be a massive energy fraud driven by the European Union, with our dear Ursula von der Leyen at the helm and a German manager, Jakob Harmuth, to sell cheap Ukrainian energy as if it were green energy in Europe. I mean, you'd say unbelievable. It's selling energy produced by the Ukrainian nuclear plant or with Ukrainian gas, if it wasn't Russian gas, and selling it in Europe as green energy. The nerve of these people. And I'm telling you, in the end, all of this is going to come out. Everything will come out in the end.
Well, that green sheen is what they call greenwashing, right? Greenwashing. But the greenwashing of war, Juan Antonio, shows the level of shamelessness of these people, of cynicism, really. Questions, Juan Antonio. Obviously, as one of the determining factors, here we see the unsustainable situation of Ukraine in the face of Russian air attacks that began about 2 months ago, following Putin's decision to finally target Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Why did Putin delay that decision for so long, if in the end it's leading to this outcome?
I think they believed, perhaps mistakenly, it was a Russian miscalculation. They thought, well, when they see that greater damage is about to occur, they'll come to their senses. I think for a while there was a Russian miscalculation in the sense of believing that somehow some sovereignty still remained in the country. Maybe not in Zelensky, but in certain people, high-ranking military officers, members of the Rada, people like that, who could at some point say, hey, this path is leading us to disaster. And maybe that would have pushed for negotiations so things wouldn't have reached this point. But obviously, when what Kiev has done, which in reality wasn't done by Kiev but by Brussels, by NATO, is to say, no, I'm going to give you missiles for attacks 300 kilometers inside Russia, or 450, or 600, even the threat of tomahawks to strike at 1200. When you're providing technology, drones, and so on that can strike 1,000 kilometers inland, it's clear that you have no intention of stopping. When they offer you a ceasefire to avoid attacking electrical and energy infrastructure for a month, a 1-month ceasefire, fine. Let's see if that works. Russia respects it.
Venga, a ver si eso funciona. Rusia lo respeta. Y Zelensky lo que se dedica es a lanzar ataques sobre refinerías.
And what Zelensky does is launch attacks on refineries and at times directly on the civilian population. So of course it's clear that there comes a point when not just Putin, but the circle around him, high-ranking officials, top military leaders, and even part of the population itself, because that starts to show up in polls, in letters sent to the media, and so on. When you start to feel that pressure, you have no choice because it's your own people demanding it. Because let's not get confused. We've been lied to constantly here, since they don't tell the truth even by mistake. They almost let us loose, starting with the president of the Spanish government, who's a fool in this regard. I mean, how is Putin, the imperialist, the autocrat, the radical, the madman? Putin is the moderate one. Putin is the moderate one, the one who has tried to move very slowly, making sure the damage didn't go any further, trying to stop this before it spread too far. It's impossible. And of course, there comes a point when you have to shut down airports inside Russia because there are Ukrainian drones flying around. And the population starts saying, well, how long are we going to put up with this? And that creates pressure. And there comes a moment when, well, there's no other choice, especially when you start to notice that the Ukrainian front is weakening. So you say, okay, if it's starting to weaken, and I attack the critical infrastructure and the logistical lines, I'm sending the signal that they won't be able to hold out much longer, that at some point it will be impossible to sustain the war. And that's the point we've reached. And it's the point we're at today. This doesn't mean that the war, from a military standpoint, is about to end next month. It could still take about a year, practically. But right now there are 6 cities on the verge of falling into Russian hands. 6. A gigantic pocket is about to form between the cities of Konstantinovka and Slavyansk, practically trapping what remains operational of the Ukrainian army there. There are no defensive lines beyond that area, all the way to the Dnieper. In other words, the situation from a military standpoint is already very bad, very bad. And well, there it is. So what can NATO do? Let's admit it, it can't do anything. It can't do anything because it lacks the troops, the sufficient weaponry, the resolve, the unity, and the political will to do it. Because if there ever was a paper tiger here, it was in Brussels. What we have now is a paper kitten.
Could it be that some technical or production-related issue also partly determined the delay of the offensive? The fact that perhaps only recently has Russia been able to mass-produce drones to carry out attacks involving 500 drones per wave.
And before it couldn't do that, right? You come to the conclusion that in the next 6 months, we won't be able to have enough resources to launch an offensive at one point or another. Of course that's true. That of course happens. It happens to any army. It's part of a general staff calculation. So yes, something like that can definitely happen. Russia's current ability to launch deep attacks is much greater than it was 2 years ago. Of course it is, obviously. Why? Because it has set its entire military production machinery in motion, building logistical lines and perfecting weapon systems that had been tested in training exercises. But in the end, weapons have to be tested in real combat. And that's where things can sometimes be very different, right? As has been seen with all those so-called miraculous Western weapons that were sent. They were supposed to be tremendous compared to Russia's technological backwardness. One failure after another, one embarrassment after another. The other day, 48 hours ago, they launched an ATAC-MS missile attack on Voronezh. I think there were 6 missiles, all 6 shot down. Not a single one hit. That means the layered air defense line that Russia has already set up across its entire western territory is formidable. Something that obviously it didn't have in place 2 years ago.
Cosa que evidentemente hace 2 años no tenía montada. Se ha ido adaptando a el tipo de guerra.
It has been adapting to the type of war it was entering. Of course, I mean, all of that is good. No, it's that the Russians learned very quickly. No, it's that setting all that up. We're talking about several thousand kilometers of lines, of fronts. I mean, you have to set up an entire layered air defense line over such an immense territory. You don't do that in a month or even in 4 months. And you need a lot of equipment that probably has to be manufactured and then deployed, and the crews have to be trained. In other words, it's not immediate. I mean, anyone who thinks these things are... We always say it, right? That this isn't a Hollywood war. I mean, 99% of Hollywood war movies are lies. A damn lie.
Yes, and in fact, Juan Antonio, here's the proof that Russia began the special military operation without the intention of a large-scale war, because only after 2 years has it finally been able to boost its military industry, its armed forces, and mobilize its population, which clearly shows they did not initially want a total war.
Openly against NATO, as it finally began, by now it's clear to everyone that the attack with 120,000 men, carried out at the start of the military operation, was a shock attack meant to provoke a change in Kyiv. And in fact, it almost worked, because an agreement was reached in Istanbul. It almost worked. Why wasn't that agreement signed? For the reason we've said 1,000 times, and which is becoming more and more obvious. Because Kyiv doesn't decide anything. Nothing. And what exists there is nothing but a network of corruption, a criminal network with its branches and headquarters outside Kyiv. And now what's happening? Well, the United States with Trump has to play a double game right now, which is basically to save itself, and to do that it's going to sacrifice Ukraine. It's that simple. Politics works that way, and especially international politics. That is, the United States isn't looking for a just peace, right? The Europeans say they can't make a peace treaty, a peace plan, without involving the Europeans. Come on, of course they can. They can do it easily, because their influence matters less than Don Placido's livestock. In other words, they don't matter at all. So yes, it can be done perfectly well. So, the United States isn't looking for a just peace. It's looking for a way out of the disaster. That's what it's after, a way out of the disaster. And to achieve that, it uses a series of tools, such as the issue of corruption, which it knows perfectly well, as leverage to force Zelensky to accept the plan. The plan, as I said, we'll see what it looks like once it's discussed with the Russian side, because there could still be more to it. What's happening? Well, it's also true that there are only 2 options. Either Zelensky accepts the plan or he doesn't. If he accepts it, that will also be the end of Zelensky. Logically, from there, if there's a peace plan, there will have to be elections, which Zelensky is not going to win. We can safely start betting on it, because we'll win. Zelensky is not going to win. So let's say he's already reached his expiration date. And if Zelensky refuses, then more scandals will keep coming out, more and more scandals. The Ukrainian public will be stirred up so that, tired of the war and tired of the corruption, they decide the regime must end. Which is exactly what the US administration wants. And well, as I said before, in the end they'll install, maybe on an interim basis until elections, a new administration completely directed by the United States. And that's it. And this will all happen amid the confusion of a Europe that has no plan B, no plan at all, nothing. In other words, Europe opposes the plan. Europe opposes the U.S. peace plan.
Europa se opone al plan de paz de Estados Unidos.
Aquí, Juan
Es
Antonio,
hasta ridículo.
imágenes de recién hace minutos de
Here,
de la
Juan
campaña de
Antonio,
Caroline Levitt,
images from just a few minutes ago of the White House spokesperson, Caroline Levitt, confirming the plan and saying that it's a good plan for both Russia and Ukraine. Those are Caroline Levitt's exact words. On the other hand, Juan Antonio, Russia could endorse a proposal of this kind, which effectively meets practically all of Russia's demands, except for the complete annexation of Zaporizhia and Kherson. The plan establishes a freeze along the current line of combat in that region. What are the pros and cons from the Russian perspective regarding this plan?
En principio, frente a los objetivos iniciales planteados por...
In principle, compared to the initial objectives set by Russia before the start of the military operation, if the plan is accepted, the Ukrainian army will obviously be reduced to a simple defensive armed force, without offensive weapons. That is what Russia called demilitarization. The regime will change. It has to change, because political parties that are currently banned must be allowed, social leaders who are in exile or in prison, as well as politicians, must be recognized. The Russian language must be recognized as an official language, and the Russian Orthodox Church must be acknowledged as a fully recognized church with the ability to operate. All of this was part of what the Russians called denazification.
Por parte de los rusos. No entrada en la OTAN, es decir, neutralidad, era un punto crítico.
Not joining NATO, that is, neutrality, was a critical point. It's also in the plan. No foreign troops, Russia was not going to accept that. It's also in the plan. And the issue of the new pseudo-European architecture, which logically will take longer to finalize because it affects not only Ukraine but many other NATO countries. Here I imagine that even international treaties on strategic weapons such as New START or on intermediate range weapons and even on conventional forces will be discussed. But the same guarantees that must be given to Ukraine must also be given to Russia. And therefore, what would remain? Are the Russians going to give up that part of Kherson and that part of Zaporizhia that are now constitutionally part of the Russian Federation? Well, I suppose that will be up for discussion.
Bueno, eso supongo que entrará en discusión. A lo mejor se buscará un referéndum de nuevo en esas dos regiones.
Maybe a referendum will be sought again in those two regions. But I honestly believe that the Russians are already thinking more long-term. In the long term, once the situation within what remains of Ukraine is, let's say, normalized, there will be political forces supported from abroad, and at a certain point, there may be governments that take the path, as Medvedchuk says, of seeking a situation, since they won't be joining NATO, similar to the one Belarus once had, or the one it currently has. It's a sovereign country, but with a kind of alliance or strategic interconnection, the Union State as they call it, with Russia, and that would be, well, the absolute victory. It would be the absolute victory. What's happening? That there are other players who might also be thinking about taking their share. For example, the Poles, about reclaiming certain oblasts in western Ukraine, with towns with Polish populations that historically belonged to Poland. Maybe they think those areas should return to Poland. Or what might happen with regions that have Hungarian or Romanian minorities, also quite discriminated against by the current Kiev government. Well, we'll see how that ends. In other words, keep in mind that this is starting a process now that won't be short. It's a long process. But yes, since we've talked about the military and political situation, we also have to talk about the economic situation. Ukraine's current budget deficit is $60 billion a year. The deficit. In other words, it's not sustainable. It can't be maintained.
No se puede mantener eso, ¿no? Si a esto le sumamos, pues que no tienen
If we add to that the fact that they need billions just to pay government employees, basically nothing is being produced anymore. What will happen to Ukraine? Who's going to pay for the reconstruction? Even BlackRock has pulled out because it no longer sees the possibility of a big business opportunity. So what's going to happen next? Well, I don't know, but I'm completely sure the Russians have a plan. If they accept that peace plan, it's because they have a plan. But in any case, look, if you're planning a military campaign, you set 6 objectives and you've already achieved 5. Sign it. Let's see about the 6th later. Of course, that's how it is. That's why I say this is a complete defeat.
Por eso digo que esto es una derrota completa. De hecho, es la formalización de la derrota.
In fact, it's the formalization of defeat, because the defeat is already there. This plan arises because the defeat is already there. That's what I think many of these analysts in our media don't quite understand. That is, when you reach this situation, and the most important geostrategic actor in the conflict, which is the United States, because it's the one that has sustained it, since without the United States it wouldn't have been sustained. If the most important actor has to propose a peace plan, and in that peace plan 5 out of the 6 objectives originally set by Russia are already conceded, it's because the defeat is already complete. All that's left now is to formalize it and do it in a way that doesn't look like what it really is. Something that saves face for Trump, or for the U.S. administration, or for the United States, if we want to put it that way, to avoid the debacle, the collapse. In other words, it's almost a cosmetic issue now. And of course, the sooner the better, because right now we're talking about what we're talking about. No, we're going to stop military operations along the current line of contact. But if we take another 6 months, the line of contact will be much closer to the Dnieper. The territory in Russian hands will keep growing, and on top of that, it's accelerating. From 20 square kilometers per day, 4 months ago, it went up to 30, then 50, and in recent days, in some cases, it's more than 100 square kilometers per day. If it keeps going like this, by the time this is ready to be signed, Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and Bakhmut will already have fallen. And if it takes another 4 months, more cities, more mines, more industries, and more logistics centers will fall, and Ukraine's infrastructure will be even more destroyed. So of course, it's not crazy. This is, yes, formalizing the defeat, that's true. But it's also true that it's a way to avoid total collapse, and to prevent the situation from feeling even worse and far more costly for a Trump administration that in 10 months faces midterm elections and risks losing Congress and the Senate. It's not that crazy.
Sí.
No es tan locura, ¿eh?
Sí, evidentemente, ahí aparece.
Yes, obviously an important factor comes into play there, because a likely defeat of Trump could pave the way for the Democrats' return, and an escalation with the neoconservative hawks back in the White House, even more so than with Trump.
En la Casa Blanca, más aún que con Trump. No la abandonaron del todo, pero...
They didn't completely abandon it, but, and not only that, there are other factors that come into play in U.S. domestic politics. We have the whole Biden issue, for example. Of course, I mean, when you have to come up with a strategy for a specific conflict, the Ukrainian question, yes, but aside from the Ukrainian issue, on the Oval Office desk you have more matters. The Chinese, internal affairs, Biden, the economy. Of course, there are more issues, and in the end, what a statesman has to do is try to gauge which leaks can be plugged in order to tackle others that are more difficult or less manageable. And obviously, regarding Ukraine, if those who know on paper are already clear that the war is lost, the sooner it ends, the better. The smaller the loss will be. Yes, now on the other hand, Juan Antonio.
Sí, ahora, por otro lado, Juan Antonio, Putin evidentemente deberá realizar una decisión estratégica.
Putin will obviously have to make a strategic decision in response to this. Now, on the other hand, considering the possibility of the return of an administration even more warlike than Trump's regarding Ukraine, and also recalling NATO's lies from beginning to end, also remembering that so far, Europe openly rejects this and wants more war, with the announcement of a direct war with Europe a few years from now. According to political figures, they set the year a little earlier or a little later, but they all already present it as a given. Also recalling the madness of Ukrainian nationalism and its usefulness to Western powers, the counter-argument of rejecting this could also seem valid, because the West would simply want a peace agreement to delay a direct confrontation, rebuild its forces, and in that sense, Putin would be making a mistake if he doesn't deliver a knockout blow now and instead settles for a victory on points.
Exactly, but then you do a scenario-based analysis. The Trump administration plays the game of fait accompli and imposes on Zelensky and his clique. You have to accept this plan. As I said, Zelensky, well, not Zelensky, he doesn't really matter. The other Western actors, meaning Brussels, London, have two options, accept it or not. If it's accepted, it's a huge problem. But it's a huge problem for Europe, not for the United States. The United States steps out of the issue, and it steps out cleanly. The big problem is for Europe. Why? Because then if the Ukrainian question ends, how are they going to justify the rearmament, the hundreds of thousands and more hundreds of thousands of millions of euros in weaponry, in military infrastructure projects? How is all that going to be justified? And if it can't be justified, then what happens to the European economy? And what if the sanctions on Russia have to be lifted? What if the frozen funds have to be returned? What then? For Europe, it's a disaster, which means another scenario is possible. The other scenario is that Europe says no. That is, Brussels and London say no. Zelensky, knowing he has no more options, digs in and says, either you keep supporting me or I say no. But then the United States is left with only one option, to effectively destroy Zelensky and in the worst case, say you're on your own. And without American support, neither the Kiev regime nor NATO can hold out much longer. They may be able to justify military spending to European populations. They may be able to maintain that discourse, that narrative they have today, but that won't prevent defeat. In fact, Putin has the whole field open to continue advancing, knowing as well that the United States won't make a move. What will happen in the future if the administration changes in 3 years? Within 3 years, all military objectives must be achieved. That's why I believe the war has, if nothing changes, if there's no peace plan, about a year, maybe a bit more, left. Where will the final military objectives be achieved? Possibly by reaching Odessa, and that's it, with NATO unable to do anything and the United States unwilling to get involved, even though it has indeed tried, and Trump has to sell that he has tried. In other words, Trump logically has to save himself, save his administration, by saying, look, there's a corrupt, thieving, despicable man in Kyiv, supported by a gang of corrupt, thieving, despicable people in Brussels and London. There's no other way. These are the only possible scenarios. Well, none of them are infallible. Some viewer might say to me, hey, there's another possibility. And it's true, there could be some other possibility. But in terms of probabilities, these are the two possible scenarios. If Zelensky digs in, he's finished. And if they put Zaluzhny in and he continues with the same approach of following Brussels and London, then the United States will withdraw from the matter it has tried, and Putin will have a clear path to continue the military campaign. If Zelensky agrees, Putin achieves most of his objectives. The issue is closed, at least for now. We'll see in the future what happens in that new political scenario in Ukraine. But the disaster is for Europe. Because the defeat is complete. They no longer have Nord Stream, nor cheap gas, nor the frozen funds. They're not going to have anything. Yes, but of course, they'll be able to justify the Russian threat, the rearmament, the mandatory military service, and all these absurd ideas they've come up with just to scam European citizens and keep control over them. Because no one really thinks that an open NATO war with Russia is going to be resolved by drafting a few 100,000 young people. They'll just drop a few atomic bombs, and then what do we do? Right?
Yes, Zelensky could also create an exit similar to that of the Belarusian opposition leader Tikhanovskaya, somehow presenting his departure as a forced one, appearing as the Ukrainian leader in exile, protected by Europe, so that the conflict appears resolved on paper, but remains latent in practice, while both Zelensky and Europe wait for Trump's replacement and for the conflict to heat up again in 2 years. That's one possibility, with or without Zelensky, right?
Esa una posibilidad, con Zelensky o sin Zelensky, ¿no? Pero como el conflicto supuestamente resuelto, pero no resuelto del todo.
But since the conflict is supposedly resolved, though not entirely, we might have to start everything over again in 3 years. Sure, but what's also happening is that, the main player there that wants to reach that point is Brussels, London, right? But it's also true that within the European Union, the division is growing every day. Before it was just Hungary, then Slovakia joined in. Now it's also the Czech Republic, Ireland, meaning that tomorrow it could even be France itself. There are elections coming up. It's becoming less and less clear that there will be any kind of unanimity to say we're all going to war. And that's not even considering how the populations feel.
Eso sin contar cómo están las poblaciones. Solo hay que ver las cifras de popularidad de Merz.
You just have to look at Merz's popularity numbers. They haven't even been around for a year, and they've already dropped below 17%. It's just not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable. Especially in a Europe that's economically heading toward disaster, that's going to have to pay for everything at a much higher cost, in a process of deindustrialization, capital flight, brain drain, and loss of technological competitiveness to China and other players. Are we going to war in 2028? With what? Who are you going to war with, you fool? Let's see what follows. Belgium, military service isn't mandatory for now because they always move step by step. Because since they don't have the guts to say things directly, they go step by step. So they've already sent a letter to all Belgian young people who will turn 18 next year to tell them they have the opportunity of a lifetime. The opportunity of a lifetime. To enlist in the army for 2,000 euros a month. Obviously, it's quite possible that many young people who are unemployed, youth unemployment in Belgium is at 13%, will say, well, I'll enlist for a year. After all, if there's not going to be a war, hey, a year earning 2,000 euros a month, right? It might be predictable. But of course that's misleading. First, because it's voluntary now. Second, because we'll see if you can, let's see what they make you sign for. Let's see what they make you sign for. And third, because if at some point a war situation arises, then you can't say you didn't sign. And we'll see what happens. But as I'm telling you, the option of not going for a peace agreement now for Europe is bread for today and hunger for tomorrow, because you'll face the problem later on. But of course, if the peace plan is accepted, the disaster will be real. It's just, well, that's what defeats are like.
Yes, of course, obviously.
Of course, that's the thing about defeats. Everyone starts thinking, well, if we had done, well, the German command could have thought that in 45, right? Once the defeat happens, what do you want? What do you want? Oh, are you going to do what? Mobilize 20-year-old kids to send them where? With what weapons? How are you going to train them? Are you going to militarize all of Europe? With what money? Where are you going to get it from? Are you going to starve people or leave them without health care, without education? What are you going to do? Look, all of this is so disgraceful that to believe in their unity, just one fact, the cost of maintaining all Spanish roads is about 1.1 or 1.2 billion euros a year.
lo que se le va a dar a Zelensky, pues haberse paseado.
What Zelensky is going to get for parading around here 2 days ago with that whole bunch of freeloaders, vermin, and parasites who govern us is €1 billion. In other words, Spaniards, from your money, a sum equivalent to what's needed to maintain all the roads in your country has been handed over to the corrupt thief in Kyiv. To fix the potholes, which there are, to repair the deterioration, which there is, to address the dangerous spots, which there are plenty of. And instead of doing that, we give the corrupt thief $1 billion for Alibaba's cave. What for? So that $1 billion goes to the North American military-industrial complex, gets turned into weapons, sent to Kyiv. Part of those weapons are sold on the black market, and they pocket the money.
Parte de esas armas se vendan en el mercado negro y ellos embolsan el dinero. Porque este es el entramado.
Because this is the network, and surely with complicities in Brussels and London. This is the network. I mean, it's a gigantic criminal organization set up to steal the money you earn every day by getting up to work. And whoever doesn't want to see it, well, as I say, they're ignorant, and therefore, hey, we have to try to teach them. That's why we have to share all these programs. Or they're simply an accomplice of the criminal organization, an accomplice of the warmongers, and what they want is war. That's it, nothing more. Nothing more. Let no one fool themselves. If you know you can't be in favor, if you don't know because you don't have the information, then we have to try to make sure you get it. And if, having the information, you're still with this, then you're an accomplice. No, you're an enemy of the people.
Por aquí,
That's it. No need to overthink it. Over here, shh, pay attention to this moment.
Now the humorous part of the show begins. Exactly.
atención a este momento a la...
Pay attention to this moment, to the face, the doubts, the hesitations of Callas, as a reflection of Europe's situation after choosing to initially follow the United States into a war that makes no sense for Europe, and now seeming alone, exposed, right? As the United States abandons it, and with the possibility of a direct war with Russia.
La abandona y con la posibilidad de una guerra directa con Rusia. Aquí la pregunta...
Here's the journalist's question. No, because we've seen this story before. The United States and Russia are working on a plan behind.
This situation is creating a déjà vu.
Déjà vu, Estados Unidos y Rusia...
The United States and Russia are drafting a plan. We've seen this before.
Europeans are angry, they demand a seat at the table.
The Ukrainians reject the plan. The Europeans are angry, demanding a seat at the negotiating table.
Media writes that Europe is being sidelined. I mean, you know how that goes. And it's a problem for you, at least for your public.
The media then say that Europe is left out of everything, and that's a problem for you.
Perception.
What can Europe actually do to change this, to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Because the stakes at play here are enormous.
Because the interests at stake here are enormous. What do you think is needed?
Do you need a new strategy, a new approach, a new communication channel? What do you need to do to make sure this doesn't happen and that you truly have a seat at the table?
And you really have a seat at the table.
What can they do then to truly have a seat at the negotiating table? Do they need a new plan, a new strategy, a new approach? What can they do?
And here's Callas's response. Attention while hesitating.
And I would say...
Well, you know, if the minister's in,
I'd say the ministers in the room were calm, because we've seen this before.
agreed to this. So that's why we focus today's discussion.
and peace plans can't succeed if Ukrainians and Europeans don't agree with them. Ha ha! That really makes me laugh.
Well, look, for those watching us, this is very simple. We're talking about an armed conflict. Who are the belligerent countries? Anyone, especially if they read the Western press, would say, well, Russia and Ukraine. Russia, of course, is a belligerent country. Ukraine, as we've said throughout this program and repeated 1,000 times over the past 3.5 years, is not sovereign. Ukraine wouldn't have been able to hold out for 3.5 years if it hadn't had an actor behind it, financing, arming, organizing, even directing military operations, providing intelligence, diplomacy, and so on and so forth.
Etcétera, etcétera, la diplomacia, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Por lo tanto, hay un actor más que no es Ucrania.
Therefore, there is another player involved, and it's not Ukraine. Ukraine here is completely dependent. It's a proxy force. Who is that player? The United States. Who provided its satellites, its reconnaissance planes, its large electronic warfare aircraft, its heavy transport planes to handle logistics and deliver weapons? The one that has moved or tried to move its diplomatic tentacles around the world. The one that imposed sanctions. The one that carried out the plan to freeze Russian assets. The one that destroyed Nord Stream. Do you remember when Biden admitted it? No matter how much they now try to pin it on a Ukrainian diver and another Ukrainian who just happened to be there.
A un buceador ucraniano y otro ucraniano que pasaba por allí. Bien, pues si hay, entonces hay que reconocer que está.
Well, we have to acknowledge that the United States is the other belligerent party with allies in NATO. But as we all know, the United States funds about 70% of NATO. The NATO Supreme Commander is always American. And the Atlantic Alliance is something the United States dominates. The U.S. arms it. The standards are American. Therefore, the main actor, the other belligerent, is the United States. That is to say, in a peace negotiation, the actors, the belligerent parties, must be present. Russia, which is obvious to everyone, and the other is the United States. Who is Europe to demand a seat there? Who is it? Who are Sanchez and Maloney? Who are they? Nobody.
Nadie. Cipayos, sumisos.
Lackeys, submissive, a bunch of fools who think they're something, a bunch of bootlickers who spend their time talking and repeating like cockatoos whatever they're told to say. I don't want to talk about the King of Spain anymore because I don't want to get into that. I don't want to be more sarcastic. We've already been here all night. The Spanish king, the fool, right? The fool follows the path ends, but the fool keeps going. And here the dynasty keeps going. So, who is Europe to demand a seat? In what? Is it a belligerent party in the conflict? Why is it a belligerent party in the conflict? Well, first they should say it, admit it. We are a belligerent party in the conflict. Because then maybe some cruise missiles would have to be redirected elsewhere.
A lo mejor algunos misiles rusos tienen que desviar hacia otros puntos. Claro. Si no son parte beligerante del conflicto, ¿qué silla quiere dar sin las caras?
Of course. If they're not a belligerent part of the conflict, then what? Do they just want to bash each other's heads in? What's going on? They're part of the business, right? That's what they don't want to admit. So they dress it up with all this rhetoric. They're part of the business. Because since they've set up their little racket, their criminal organization, obviously if this ends, the business ends. Because otherwise, wouldn't that Europe of values, of freedom, of democracy, be the first one interested in reaching a peace agreement and ending the war? Wouldn't that be the main thing? They should all be happy that, well, maybe this will finally end. Because the war is on European soil. That's something we need to remember.
Porque la guerra es en suelo europeo. Es que hay que recordarlo. La guerra no está ahí al lado de.
The war isn't next to Atlanta or Virginia or Dakota. It's on European soil. Therefore, the first ones interested in achieving peace should be the Europeans. Because if the big bombs start to fall, they'll fall on European soil. So, what do you mean you need to have a seat? Europe needs to have a seat. We can see that Ukraine doesn't have sovereignty. Yes, it will have to sit down because someone will have to sign. I imagine it won't be Zelensky, but someone will have to sign so that the treaty, the peace agreement, is valid under international law, and it should go through the United Nations Security Council and be validated there so that it has validity under international law, of course. So, well, Ukraine will have to be there.
Claro que sí. Entonces, bueno, pues la que está en Ucrania, pero el otro actor beligerante,
But the actor, the other belligerent actor who has to be at the table, and in fact is, because they're the one presenting the plan, just think about it. They're definitely at the table. So the other actor is the United States. Is Europe's role a very sad one? Very sad. Very sad. It's reached a point where when you look at the European political class, you say they get what they deserve, they get what they deserve. I mean, a European infrastructure is destroyed, specifically, mainly a German one, the Nord Stream pipelines. And to this day, there's been no ability to demand accountability from whoever is responsible, not even to make public for European citizens to know the conclusions of the investigation. That shows us what kind of political class we have, one that, I repeat once again, unfortunately, European citizens keep voting for. Let's see if we finally start waking up.
Juan Antonio, la última, y por cierto,
Juan Antonio, the last one. And by the way, Demolishers, more than 2,700 connected and 1,600 likes. Remember that this helps us fight censorship by spreading our critical analyses. So please like, thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. The last one, Juan Antonio, about China. What is China's reaction to this? Because the eventual end of the war in Ukraine will accelerate, it will surely accelerate, the redirection of US hostilities against China, right? From Europe toward the Asia-Pacific axis. How are they going to respond to this?
¿Cómo van a responder a esto? ¿Cómo podrían participar en esto?
A ver, hay algunas dificultades.
How are they going to take part in this? Well, there's some criticism there. It's true that from a strategic point of view, like what the Rand Corporation and others do, you make your plans on paper, and it all looks great. We're going to focus on the Pacific. But we've already seen that even tariffs haven't worked against China. If China shuts off the supply of rare earths, there's not even an American military industry left. That makes it very hard to plan a war of any significant scale, a conflict of any significant scale, in the Pacific. On the other hand, Russia has become China's strategic rear base and vice versa. And that's not going to change. That's not going to change. In other words, even if sanctions are lifted, most of Russia's trade is already directed toward Asia. And that's not going to change. If only because you can't trust the Europeans. I mean, let's put it this way. You can't trust these people. These people deceive you even when they say good morning. They lie constantly. You can't trust them. Who are you going to trust? Mrs. Callas? Ursula? Who are you going to trust? How are you going to tell China, for example, no, look, I'm not going to sell you any more gas because I'm going to send it back to the Europeans? First of all, the Americans won't believe it. They want to sell their gas. The Russians play along, but at their price, the one imposed by the big oil companies, the big American energy corporations. So that's not coming back. In other words, the mistakes Europe has made in recent years will be very hard to overcome. A lot of time, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of money to overcome it. I don't know what they're going to do. Honestly, in this regard, I'm not at all optimistic. I don't know what they're going to do. Why? Because Russia is no longer going to break the dynamic it has taken of focusing on Asia. Therefore, China will maintain that strategic rear guard. It won't be lacking. That is, the United States won't be able to block China. It won't be able to surround it. It won't be able to suffocate it. So how is it going to do it? I mean, I think right now everyone is quite calm. Even second-tier actors such as India and other Central Asian countries, I think they're all quite calm. Moreover, the possibility opens up again that the situation of international trade might ease a bit, allowing business to continue. If here, as I said, the strategic defeat is NATO's, and therefore that of NATO countries, except for the United States and Canada, which are over there, a North American peninsula, then who are the NATO countries? The Europeans. That's it. Enjoy what you voted for. That's it. They're all very good, very smart, very handsome, very rich. Well, that's what we've got. I think that's not going to change anymore. It's not going to change, at least for quite some time.
No va a cambiar al menos en un tiempo considerable. Es decir, tendrían que volver a cambiar las
That is to say,
coordenadas geopolíticas a nivel global.
the global geopolitical coordinates would have to shift again for, I don't know, situations of rupture between China and Russia to occur. There would have to be very deep geopolitical changes, and it doesn't seem easy for that to happen in the medium term. In the short term, certainly not. In the medium term, I don't know. In the long term, well, history is open. You never know what might happen, right? So I don't see it for better or worse. The trend, if you project it, is that a whole series of international frameworks, like the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, will all keep converging.
Todos vayan convergiendo y se vaya creando un bloque mucho más.
And a much more independent and sovereign bloc from the Western world than it has been so far is beginning to take shape. And that's going to be inevitable. That process is underway and has been gradually accelerating, but it has been accelerating. And nothing suggests that next year, or the year after, or in 5 years, that process will stall or even reverse. There's nothing to indicate that. So I think that moreover, and this also appeared in the RAND reports and others from the RAND Corporation, the intention was to wear down Russia in order to then go after China. If they haven't been able to handle Russia, well, that complicates things.
Pues complicado está.
Sí, es efectivamente. Juan Antonio, vamos
Yes, exactly. Juan Antonio, let's wrap up the broadcast here. We've presented the current situation, the possible future scenarios, and even the possibility of the beginning of a collapse in the European Union as well. You pointed that out in your analysis of the European Union. On Saturday, Juan Antonio will present the second part of his analysis on artificial intelligence, the positive side. Today you can close the broadcast however you like, as always, with an open ending, if there's anything left unsaid, or anything else you'd like to add.
Final abierto, si algo en el tintero o lo que quieras.
Bueno, yo creo que, fíjate, hay a veces que las cosas son.
Well, I think, you see, sometimes things are sarcastic. They've called Nabu's operation against corruption in Ukraine Operation Midas, King Midas. And well, let everyone see it. This isn't like in the movie Casablanca. What a shame there's gambling here. Everyone knew there was gambling in Rick's bar. It wasn't a secret to anyone. But what a scandal. There's gambling here. So this event is nothing more than a catalyst. All of this was already, let's say, known or assumed. Everyone knew it. It's a catalyst that irreversibly weakens Zelensky and his regime. Irreversibly. We'll see how it ends. But it's the beginning of the end. It shows the lack of real sovereignty in Ukraine, which has been there from the start.
La falta de soberanía real de Ucrania que ha habido desde el principio. Por eso nunca debíamos de hablar de la guerra de Rusia con Ucrania.
That's why we should never have talked about Russia's war with Ukraine, but rather about the war in Ukraine, not against Ukraine. This is going to deepen the rift within the Western Bloc. The seams keep widening, and the fracture keeps opening more and more, and it undoubtedly plays in favor of Moscow's interests, bringing the end of the conflict closer on terms that could be favorable to the Kremlin. And this shows that they have played their cards in a, it must be said, intelligent way. That's how it is. And it's very simple. Next year, or the one after that, if peace has already been signed and so on, we'll see what the situation is like inside Russia in terms of its economic, macroeconomic, and cultural figures, what life is like, the country's vital dynamic. We'll see how Europe is doing. So something to think about, right?
Así que, para reflexionar, ¿eh?
Sí. Demoledores.
Yes. Demolishers. In 20 minutes, Adrian Zelaya's show begins. Don't miss it, on DMP Geopolitics, our sister channel. The link is below, also with a rebroadcast on our channel. And we'll be back tomorrow, Friday, as always, with our regular programming. Dear Juan Antonio, a hug, and see you next time.
Hasta la próxima. Chau.
Hasta pronto.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
it.